My mother's words. To my dying days, I will always remember that day in November, a Wednesday, a cold and rainy day in Shanghai. The year was 1942. My mother lost her husband, my father, to the Japanese captors on that day. In her book, which you see the cover of here, entitled Internment in Shanghai, she describes her day, one she will never forget. The doorbell rang at their home, and into their house marched 2 Japanese gendarmes. They barged their way into the front hall and up the front stairs. My mother quickly put on her bathrobe and met them at the top of the stairs. One of them pointed a gun at her. Pointed it into her stomach. And she was just absolutely flabbergasted at their intrusion and their rudeness, and she wasn't one bit scared of him, but she was alarmed. After all, the Japanese were beginning to intern citizens that were faithful to the Allied troops in World War II. A fine mess, she thought to herself. But the gendarme said, "Don't be alarmed," as he removed the gun from her stomach. Then the gendarme asked, "Where is Mr. Dose? When did he live here?" "He never lived here," my mother responded. "When did he move away from here?" And so on. And finally, as she stuck to her story, they brought out their ace argument, always their final answer always their final response to a question they don't like. "You lie." "Then we must search the house," as if they weren't going to do that anyway. They went into my grandmother's room, my maternal grandmother's room, and she gave them a look like she had smelled something vile. And being that the Japanese respect old age, they didn't dare touch her. They quickly departed from that room. He turned to his companion and walked into the nursery where my twin sister and I were, figuring that was not really a very scary place for arms and ammunition. They left. By this time, the gendarme was completely confused. He turned to the interpreter for advice, then called headquarters. The conversation was long and involved, and my mother held out hope that this was all a mistake. But it was not. As soon as he got off the phone, she knew that her husband was going to go, because they said, "You, Mr. Dr. Dunn, are now a political prisoner and will be interned. Your family and property will be protected." Then he added, "You must come with us." Tom said, with his usual calm, "I have an operation this afternoon. A patient is waiting for me at the hospital." They said, "I don't care. You are coming with us." So off Tom and my mother went, my dad and my mother went to pack his bag. My mother wanted to put in some cans of tinned food, not knowing when my dad would get a chance to eat, and he wouldn't allow it because the bag was already heavy and he did not know how far they would have to walk. In the meantime, the gendarme and his pals were sealing all the rooms so that we could not re-enter them, and they nailed the doors shut. But in the sleeping porch, they failed to realize that there was a window that we could crawl through. But another thing they did was seal all the telephones. Well, as I mentioned, Tom had no breakfast, and he wanted for a cup of coffee. The Jap refused to allow it. "You are a doctor and very clever. You will poison yourself." Tom, I can just imagine how furious my father was. "I love my family," he shouted out. "Much too much to do a thing like that. Why don't you have a cup of coffee with me?" "No," the Jap replied in all seriousness, "You would poison us too." My mother gave her dearly beloved husband one last desperate hug and kiss. Just like that, he walked out the door, and he was gone and down the lane. As my mother described the scene, he was flanked by two filthy Japs, carrying a duffel, which they should have been carrying for him. But my father gave my mother a gift before departing. He said, "Dorothy, there is $3,000 in my wallet on the sleeping porch." After Tom was out of sight, she was quick to action. They went into the sleeping room through the sleeping porch window, and just like Sherlock Holmes, they were very careful not to leave any footprints. The money was found, and so were personal papers of Tom. They also removed some very valuable medical books. Mother did not know where my father would be held captive. She feared that the prisoners would be sent to Bridge House. Bridge House was known for the cruelty given out by the Japanese at Bridge House. I mean, the atrocities were so horrible, I can't even mention them here in this book. But if you would like to know some of the things that the Japanese did against their prisoners and the Chinese people themselves, then buy yourself the book, Rape in Nanking. But luckily, my father was turned at the old 4th Marine Barracks on Haiphong Road. Not that that was any pleasure cruise. It wasn't. But at least it wasn't a torture chamber. All that day the phone rang, and my mother had to let it ring because it was sealed. And she knew that a lot of people were worried about my family, but she couldn't answer. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the gendarmes returned. And they searched the house again, looking for important political documents. My father was about as unpolitical as you get. He was a hard-working doctor and not involved in the political scene whatsoever in Shanghai. The gendarmes looked through my dad's medical books, but they were completely confused by what they saw. They had no idea what they were looking at. As the day ended and the worrying questions that my mother silently asked herself, would I ever see Tom again? Could this be the end of my happiness? Strange how everything seems to be exemplified in the dark of night. And that night was, my mother said, was one of the worst ones she ever experienced in her entire life. Our future was in question. Hours after hours, my thoughts ran in circles, vainly seeking a solution. But there was none, only longing and waiting. As she tossed and turned in bed that night, she dreamed about the previous good times with her beloved husband and my wonderful father. All those elegant evenings dressed to the nines while enjoying Shanghai's top events, fancy dress balls, dinner parties, you name it. These thoughts of the pleasant life, she realized, were now gone, and that the harsh reality of the current circumstances, her beloved husband, adoring father of us, the twins, the outstanding doctor, the love of her life. She wondered, would I ever see him again? Finally, emotionally exhausted, she fell asleep. On that day she said she would never forget. Internment in Shanghai, the book, a memoir, can be yours by clicking the link in the post, taking you back to a time in history where my parents went from riches to rags as they endured the egregious cruelty of the Japanese captors. A true story and account of a devastating time in history when the world descended into global war. My parents got caught during an insurrection that left them suffering and separated. A cruel chapter in the history of the world. Think about this. My parents suffered greatly. Can you imagine what it would have been like had you been hauled off by the enemy, then imprisoned, no rights, no nothing, and of course tearing apart your family with no end to this nightmare in sight?